Hey there, everybody. Welcome back to another 21st Century Renaissance and another open interest news at a breakdown on GameStop. I'm your host, Dr. Michael LoPiano, and today we are going to look at some things that are starting to pop up under the hood with respect to GameStop, if you will. Taking a look at some of our ETF, FTD data, cost to borrow, and the like. Seeing what that may have to tell us, especially in light of, this very excellent model that Richard Newton spent quite a lot of time putting together. So we're taking a look at what GameStop is looking like today through that lens. We're also going to take a look at continuing on right in the story of Noah, right? This very interesting episode, this sort of recreative episode with respect to the world in the book of Genesis, the book of Becoming. So let's turn our attention first over to our biblical passage for today. And you recall, right, we discussed, especially yesterday, right, the sort of processing, thinking about the way that these lineages, what they have culminated in with respect to the world. And sort of the episode of Noah and the decision to cleanse the world of life in large part pertains right to the consequences of the sin of Adam, and particularly the legacy of Cain down unto his descendant Lamech, and this sort of parallel lineage of mankind that emerges upon the earth. And so it is God's desire to wipe out life, with the exception of what Noah preserves. Noah's way of being in the world, of which he is an embodiment. So we spoke a little bit about the implications of what this had to say, especially with respect to what the Bible then has to say about the value of, say, even making decisions to live according to this pattern of being, the sort of pattern of being that Noah embodies with respect to its importance for the world, right? World redeeming, life preserving, something of the sort. To raise a family, raise it well, walk in such a way, live one's life such that one is open to, communication from the divine, which is an interesting thing to consider. So we get something more so of, something of a nuts and bolts account of what exactly happens here during the account of the flood. So let's take a look. And the flood was 40 days upon the earth, and the waters increased and bare up the ark, and it was lift up above the earth. And the waters prevailed and were increased greatly upon the earth, and the ark went upon the face of the waters. And the waters prevailed exceedingly upon the earth, and all the high hills that were under the whole heaven were covered. 15 cubits upward did the waters prevail, and the mountains were covered. And all flesh died that moved upon the earth, both of fowl and of cattle, and of beasts, and of every creeping thing that creepeth upon the earth, and every man. All in whose nostrils was the breath of life of all that was in the dry land died. And every living substance was destroyed which was upon the face of the ground, both man and cattle and creeping things, the fowl of the heaven, they were destroyed from the earth. And Noah only remained alive, and they that were with him in the ark. And the waters prevailed upon the earth 150 days. God remembered Noah, every living thing, and all the cattle that was with him in the ark. And God made a wind to pass over the earth, and the waters were assuaged. The fountains also of the deep and the windows of heaven were stopped, and the rain from heaven was restrained. And the waters returned from off the earth continually. And after the end of the 150 days, the waters were abated. The ark rested in the 7th month, on the 17th day of the month, upon the mountains of Ararat. And the waters decreased continually until the 10th month. In the 10th month, on the 1st day of the month, were the tops of the mountains seen. So, while the setup for this story is, and perhaps asks us to consider something perhaps a bit more broadly with respect to maybe symbol metaphor and the like. We can try to say, okay, how can we adapt this, let's say, morally towards our lives? And we've thought about this as well, right? On the one hand, right, there are moral lessons to discern from the Bible, but it is important to remember that they are also not purely moral allegories, right? A lot of people, right, they kind of get, it can be easy to get lost, let's say, sometimes. And some biblical interpreters, I think, have a tendency to do this, not naming anyone in particular. But, it's important to make sure that places where moral value, behavioral value, something like that, can be extracted, right? It's important to find those pearls, to discuss the instances where those pearls are found. Very interestingly, right, that's not the only thing that is in the Bible, right? The authors of these stories, right, and these are not originally written stories, these are oral accounts that end up written down. And we know that the story itself, there is something of an flood story for the region, in particular because this story is not unique to Judaism, right? I mean, flood myths in general are universal. They can be found in every culture across the entire earth, and there are many commonplaces within these myths. So there are some conjectures as to why this is. Part of it is, maybe the most fun one is something like the Younger Dryas impact theory, things like that. Stuff like guys like Randall Carlson talk about this. Something like, there was something of a meteor impact in the polar ice caps back in, I think, around something like 10,000 BC, right? So yeah, about 12,000 years ago, maybe 13,000 years ago. And the result was a very rapid melting of the northern ice cap, which then would have resulted in something like a very large volume of water being vaporized and then, sending this kind of mega storm onto the earth, right? Something like raining for 40 days and 40 nights. I mean, the number itself is not meant to be precise, but symbolic, right? That's a very long storm. It rained for a month and a third. And then after this, right, it would have meant that there would have been a flood of essentially hitherto never before seen proportions. Randall Carlson has some pretty good geological arguments to this, pointing at, say, especially North America and the North American landscape, as far as looking at geological formations that are made by essentially huge melt flows that are maybe 100 times the size of any river you've ever seen, something like that. So very curious, but flood myths themselves, okay, so there is this possible idea that there was really this flood of truly global cataclysmic proportions, the least affected continent of which would be Africa. So Africa would act as something of an arc of civilization, and it is perhaps no surprise that as a result, Africa as a continent shows something like it shows the greatest biodiversity on Earth. It shows the greatest cultural diversity of human beings. It also shows the greatest genetic diversity of human beings, is all internal to Africa, very interestingly. So something like there is, and this, I forget exactly where this comes from, but there is a greater, as far as I remember, there is a greater genetic diversity within Africa than there is, actually, this is from Charles Murray. This is Human Diversity by Charles Murray is where I learned this. There is a greater genetic diversity in Africa than there is between all of the other populations in the rest of the world. So, right, there is a greater genetic diversity between, say, any two random Africans than, say, a European and an East Asian, right? Very interesting to consider. So, okay, so there's this perhaps flood that causes this, but then even there are sort of kind of local variations. on this myth. And what's very interesting is that the particular myth which is depicted here has comparisons in something like you've got the Epic of Gilgamesh has a flood myth in which it's like, I forget the name of the character. It's like Ushkapanit or something like that. Essentially builds a boat. There are, right, as we'll see, right, as the next sort of commonplace, and this is organized into commonplaces. So the first is the building of the boat. As we'll see next, right, there is, as we see, Noah sends a raven and a dove. There is the news of the resumption of the flood or the end of the flood is a result of birds. So there's some sort of a box, right? Ark means like a box. It's very interesting, right? It doesn't say a boat. It says he built like a box, like something to keep it. I forget that. Actually, we have the Septuagint right here. I'll take a look at the Greek word, but the Greek word is the same as it's like a box. But in any case, rather than just look through this, there are commonplaces here. There's also commonplaces in the Greek myth. So the myth of Deucalion, which is preserved in the poetry of Ovid, for example, the Metamorphoses. The myth of Deucalion has the same commonplaces. And so there is some sort of an event. I mean, throughout time, there were different opinions on how these interlocked, how these were interrelated. It's suspected that of the written versions we have, something like the Epic of Gilgamesh may be the oldest written version that we have, with Genesis being the particular version of Genesis that we have is younger. And then the Greek version may possibly have been, there may have been a Greek flood myth that then merged, of course, because the Greeks accepted a lot of Semitic culture and Semitic religion from the Phoenicians, from the Anatolians. And this Anatolian component is very important, right? This is the region of modern day Turkey. Why? Because where does Noah end up? But he ends up on Mount Ararat, which is in the region of Greater Armenia, the peak of which is in today's Republic of Turkey. So he ends up right, east of Turkey. So actually, we have a little map on the screen here. We can't see it too well. You can kind of see it down here, right? It's in what is today Eastern Turkey. It's basically on the border with Armenia and Iran. That's Greater Armenia. So there is also this dimension, right? This is not. And the Bible stories, make this clear. This is not something that was conjectured, right? This is not concocted, not artificed. There may be some artifice, right? Artifice may be in the addition process. But these stories are not, back to my original point, right? They are not constructed moral allegory. Someone did not sit down with a lesson in mind, let's say, and make up this story, right? It's different, let's say, than Plato's allegory of the cave, something like that. This is a very popular one, Plato's allegory of the cave. Why is it different? Because Plato sat down and thought up that story, right? It's different, let's say, than, to a certain extent, some of the parables, although the parables are also a little bit different. They're a little bit, allegory itself can be a little, for lack of a better term, superstitious, in the sense that it stands out. It's things that, it's picture, if you will, like Rod Serling in The Twilight Zone or something like that. It's like, it's nothing that would happen, whereas parables attempt to draw parallels between patterns in nature and in human relationships. There is an attempt in the telling of these types of stories to represent events as they happened, right? To preserve the memory of these events. And over time, the reason why these details are preserved is because there is something of moral value, let's say, contained within them. it is something like the perspective value or the behavioral procedural value for acting and being in the world is contained in the story, but the story itself is not thought up such as to convey the idea. It's almost like the experience and the idea over time preserves and sort of solidifies the structure of the story so that it has that shape over time. And it's for this reason that even though you see this distributed among a number of cultures, across many cultures, despite the fact that it's not written down until much later, that these cultures still have these varying fragments that bear many commonplaces, that bear these common elements. So I would say, as a takeaway here, right, this is something a bit more, how do we think about these stories rather than how do we discern, say, something immediately applicable to say something that we should be doing or could be doing or something of the sort. But that, right, this is an attempt, right? The biblical corpus is an attempt to pull together as, I suppose, accurate, sometimes not precise, but as accurate and multivarious a picture of being in the world as it is and as it was. And that includes how things actually did unfold over time. So part of, I suppose, what can lend credence to some of the elements of this story is, well, if a lot of what this collection has to share can be applied to life and produce fruitful results, then, we can reasonably say that it was compiled with the intention of aiming at truth, something like that, right? And so you can kind of think about that as well with respect to how you might undergo analysis on something like, you're trying to assess the validity or the efficacy of a particular heuristic when, analyzing GameStop or something like that. Price movement, various data. We're going to look at some different forms of data today. But, how to make that, how to tell, right? How to put, right? Because, people will say, well, bash stuff like they'll bash charts, they'll bash TA, they'll bash FT, right? And individually, they'll say, this doesn't do it, right? If I look at this thing individually, it doesn't, it doesn't tell me, right? It doesn't tell me anything. Oh, you say something going on with FTDs, or you draw a line on a chart, all this is meaningless. There's always somebody in the comments. There's always somebody in the comments. But the thing is, right, no, if you can compile enough of these ways of looking at things, right, even if it's not 100% precise, not precise to, let's say, the level of precision in certain domains that we enjoy today, it can nonetheless yield some fruit that you'd rather not be without. And the biblical corpus, as far as I understand it, and the way that these stories work, is that they attempt to do something similar, right? They attempt to present many different sort of sub or compartmentalized ways of viewing human action in the world, decisions, value, the structure of the world, through these examples of human history, which are to a greater or lesser extent precise. So something to think about there. And as we continue on with our reading, hopefully, right, this is something I can see after going through this many, many, many times, thinking about this for a long time. But hopefully, as we continue through this, some of you will start to perhaps gain some of that insight as well. Very curious to hear what you think. All right, let's go ahead and move on over to our analysis, taking a look at some of our data here over on GameStop. And today, right, of course, we're T-2 to OPEX coming up next, today, tomorrow, right, by and large, not really thinking too much is going to go down. Maybe we get a little bit of kick up, a little bit tomorrow up towards 24. Not really thinking too much past that, but we're going to take a look at some of these. We haven't touched on some of these FTD analytics in a while, what's going on with ETFs. So we'll take a peek there. Before we get started, we'll go ahead and send out some gratitude over to Dude McStud, once again, for sponsoring today's article and video breakdown, as well as to our monthly supporters, Not Medical Advice, Kurt Lusko, Cosmotropic, Dayswag52, Cameron DeLeon, Drew Krantz, and Hey Luckies, aka Faithless Looter, for supporting the channel on a monthly basis. Thank you very much. So yeah, some things stood out logging in today, taking a look at our data, and it is that we have XRT borrow fee spiking. Actually, we have some very interesting borrow fee type stuff spiking. SLV, so Altimeter 5 calling this out earlier today. SLV, silver derivatives ETF, absolutely going parabolic, not only in terms of price, but in terms of borrow fee. Very little available to borrow on that. Why does that matter? Silver is a very important thing that Altimeter looks at when he's giving us our bottom finder. I know we've been looking at bottom finder recently because it's been sending some pretty interesting signals here. Basically, it's sending us highest value since 2023, right? Since January 2023. It is really sky high, and it keeps moving up. And a lot of that has to do, right? So if we take a look here, right? A lot of that has to do with the fact that silver is going absolutely nuts. And you'll recall, going back to the 2021, sort of the aftermath of the sneeze, at the end of January, early February, I remember this. I remember seeing this on some of these CNBC videos. I remember seeing targeted Reddit ads, like stuff like this, back in the midst of that. And all of it had to do with like silver, right? Silver squeeze. Are meme stock traders targeting silver? I think no. But what seems to be the case, certainly what Altimeter is suggesting, is that silver disruption in the silver market, seeing things like this in silver, is probably a good indicator that something connected to GameStop will bring some kind of effect in the near future. Particularly, the stipulation is that silver is likely swapped with GameStop. So if silver is moving up parabolically, at the same time, what would be going down? I suppose, right, we said something like that JPY is going down. Well, no, at the time that JPY is also going up. So if JPY and silver are moving up at the same time, it's generally a good indicator that GameStop is going to do the same. So silver going nuts, XRT borrow fee also going nuts. Of course, we know that IGME, GMEU, GMEY, these three new leveraged derivatives-based GME ETFs, very few shares available to borrow. Their shares outstanding are going nuts, and they have very high cost to borrow as well. If we take a look, right, something that also popped up, something that's not super common, is if we look at September here, we can see very, very common that we're seeing large numbers of GME fails kind of stacking up back to back to back. In fact, right, I think this should have put us on Reg Show right here. And yeah, I mean, these are very persistent, right? We're not seeing these days of 0, right? This is all right. 9.9 right on earnings, 345,000 fails, 9.10, 600,000, 9.11, 417,000, 9.12, 130,000. This is pretty interesting. Stays up, right? They only get it down on 17, and then it goes right back up. 9.18, 172,000, 9.19, 152,000, 9.23, 469,000. Very interesting to see this. In addition to what we're seeing, say, over on the ETF side of things, what this suggests, right, is maybe some cracks starting to compound beneath the hood of this market car, right? And right, what that typically suggests is that there needs to be something of a pressure valve release. Now, I think we've taken a look and we've suggested certainly what some of this silver nonsense suggests. What Bottom Finder is suggesting is these past couple of weeks have hosted, right, and especially this deep extension to the downside, largely has to do with the processing of swaps. Maybe swaps going back 5 years, as we saw earlier this week with that very strange $3 per share transaction overnight, 1:17 a.m. Eastern time. 5 years to the day since GME last traded at $3. Saw some questionable after hours action yesterday. No, 2 days ago. So very interesting. So maybe some swap stuff going on here. But what we have here is an image of Richard Newton's old ETF model, which has been updated and is being updated. I'm not exactly sure who it is, but someone out there in the whole sphere is doing a public version of this. It is findable, maybe for those of you who are trying to keep along with it, right? And what we'll notice from Richard's model, I mean, we see these kind of very interesting spikes, right? And GME does not always directly line up with the height, let's say, to scale of these spikes, right? We are having some divergence, let's say, here, but the fact that we get, say, these parallel kind of double top structures is very interesting. Parallel double top right here, right? So there is something homologous. There is, especially with shape and direction, we can kind of see where the introduction of, say, certain instruments related to company activity. So where we don't have this show up in the ETF model. So right here, right, of course, we have we have earnings and then the second convertible bond hop in right here. We have the front, you can see, right? So this is the divergence based on the Bitcoin announcement. So this is front running, does not show up in the ETF model. Then we can see the precipitous shot down here, right? Races this to the downside. Right, for just about a month here, right? This has to do with the second convertible bond offering. And then, we did start to move up here, although this does look capped. For what reason, not sure. But right, we started to diverge a bit here. But we can see that on these key dates, we have turning points. So something, right, even though you might not base this price-wise, you might not say, okay, this matches up necessarily dollar for dollar on the particular day. It does get the shape right. So it does seem to suggest that the ETF action, whatever's going on behind the scenes with ETF settlement, with FTDs, that this is, it has a non-zero influence, right? Exactly how much, who knows, but enough to sort of get the broad shape of these trends correct, to get pivot days largely correct, especially with the right magnitude of move. So it does suggest that ETFs are continuing to play a role here. And what it does suggest, if helpfully visualized here in Richard's model, that we'll start moving to the upside essentially again, right into this cluster. Now, is it going to turn into this crazy spike up to 35? I don't think so. I could be wrong, right? I don't know. But what this does say to me is maybe we get something like a smooth kind of trend. And if I would sort of judge this myself, I'd do something like draw a trend line through the middle of this and then say, okay, maybe, we can kind of base a similar slope from our current price position back there as well. I mean, maybe we just go way steeper, right? Maybe we go up into the 30s or something like that on this end of things. Who knows? Maybe, right, Ryan Cohen issuing these warrants at $32. The price was selected specifically because, well, if we look at the model here, the model said we were supposed to go right to $32. Very curious. And those are the peaks here of each of these spikes that we've got in the model, except for these really two high ones in the 35s, right? These 235 spikes. Very interesting to see that, right? This does not, right? This is Richard's model. Richard's model does not, right? Richard went offline before there was any talk of warrants. So very curious to see that the price lines up with how we might expect, or Richard's model would have projected our general ceiling to be over these next couple of months. So basically, this ETF stuff is saying we get a lot of chop, but basically that we kind of stay up going into kind of coming out of October OPEX, going into early November, and then not really kind of having a sharper move to the downside until after the institutional filing deadline on November 15th, which you recall basically we've been talking about as well, looking at what our options data has been telling us in terms of, say, some Max Payne stuff, looking at just kind of generally what we know about cycle theory, and also taking a look at what this means, right? The implications of some of our thoughts about GME being used as an interest rate swap hedge, and how, right, typically when we see GME, or when we see rate cuts, which are now essentially guaranteed for October 29th, Cat Day, that this usually results in multiple weeks of GME bullishness. as a response as institutions go ahead and buy GME in order to hedge the interest rate cut properly. So that basically lines up here, right? This move, this diagonal move that we see up into November 17th, more or less covers that period from October 29th to the institutional filing deadline. How appropriate. Then we get a dip, then we come back up, basically going into earnings, some shock and awe maybe here coming out of earnings, and then maybe a dump into the new year is basically what this says right now. So we'll see what the future holds, but very, very interesting to see that and make that comparison, right? So one way, right, especially with this approach, is if you can approach this, if you can approach anticipating price action, trying to understand these phenomena, right, by approach this from as many different types of inroads if you can. If you've got the options telling you, maybe first A, then B, and then you've got something that's tracking, say, swap adjacent market instruments and indices, and that's saying, yeah, well, first A and then maybe B. And then you go over to the ETF side of things, and ETF data is now telling you, well, around this time A, but then after A, B. You've got these three different ways of approaching the same question. But methodologically, they take different approaches. They're looking at different sources of data that are interlinked to a certain degree, but that are decently mutually exclusive, right? That's how our bodies, for example, process stuff. That's how we process the world, sense-wise. We basically have kind of two archetypes of sense. We have touch and we have vision. We have touch and vision. Those are our two archetypes. So something like, they're both energy derived, but the sense of touch has to do with like, I don't know, what is it, like electroconductivity, like, temperature has to do with this too. It has to do with like heat transfer and like various types of like electroconductivity as it's processed by the skin and like somatic nerves and things like that. And then everything that's evolved off of sight is light based. So you've got touch, you've got light, and then I guess, I'm not sure of the evolutionary history of the sense of smell, but hearing, touch becomes hearing, also becomes speech, right? They're all related to our sense of touch, at least from like a cognitive perspective, like a cognitive evolutionary perspective, something like that. But in any case, right, we have these different ways of approaching the world, and we consider the 5 principal senses. And so when we take a look, we try to encounter something in the world, we essentially pentangulate it with as much of a mutually exclusive, 5 mutually exclusive ways of approaching that. They're not perfect. They're not perfectly mutually exclusive, but something like that, right? Very curious. Very curious. So in approaching, trying to understand price action, if you can replicate that, that's basically the system that I use when I'm doing my analytics, when I'm trying to understand how stuff is going to happen. That's what I've tried to do, especially over these past couple years of trying to understand how people approach forecasting, and then trying to combine those different approaches, right, as an amateur, to inform my trading. And reasonable success works by my standards. I'll say that helps me meet my goals. If we take a look at our options data, which is something that I take a look at especially closely on a regular basis, what I would say is this is the lightest I have seen the GME options environment. I've been tracking GME options data daily for the past, more than 500 consecutive days. That is consecutive trading days. I've never seen it this light. I've never seen OI changes this light, especially not on a Thursday, especially not pre-OPEX. So what this tells me is that liquidity problem that we're seeing on the ETF side of stuff, that we're seeing now kind of spill over into maybe some of these other things like silver, which Ultimator 5 has been pointing out, that this is also spilling over into the options market. And so there's something of a multi-stage or multi-aspect or multi-market liquidity crunch going on right now. And that's likely creating problems. How those problems are dealt with is usually through, through can kicking. But as far as how well controlled that can kicking can be, that's a question of how bad the liquidity problem actually is. We're clearly seeing that also here in the options market. Our max pain strikes are not moved. GEX is really kind of unchanged, not expecting anything sort of north of $24 for OPEX, expecting something flat kind of in OPEX. Maybe we get a little excitement. Like I said, I think we probably got one day, either today or tomorrow, where we get something of some kind of a move to juice gamma a little bit, maybe, because volume is so low here. Maybe this problem starts to go away as soon as this first kind of OPEX. Well, it's going to be very interesting because there are tens of thousands, meaning hundreds of thousands of warrants that are going to need delivery across the options market because of the GME 1 chain. That getting that gone, getting those contracts off the board should help a bit, I imagine, with the liquidity issue. But interesting to see what that'll mean kind of coming out of that and what happens to our liquidity thereafter. So very interesting to observe. Again, so to kind of tie a neat bow on this, this does suggest, right, that we do have, right, we've been waiting for this. We've been waiting for, okay, is there going to be this other phase, right? Okay, we're going down. Do we just stay flat now into earnings? Like, what happens? Are we going to get this October cycle? I mean, right, my initial impression weeks ago now was like, oh, okay, cat day, rate cut. There's going to be 3 rate cuts. That's going to be another kind of inflection point, punctuation point. You'll recall, I didn't know. I was like, all right, we got this like October 10th swap, or what was it? It was October 9th. I was like, okay, October 9th. I know we got that swap. That looks like a swap to me. That guy's going to get out of the way, and then we're free. And then maybe we kind of just go sideways, and then we start to go up again. No, because we had some bigger bags that needed to get dealt with. Maybe we even had, that's the thing, right? If we see the kind of swapinator thing and the bottom finder thing going as high as they were back in 2023, back in January 2023, you recall this was right before Credit Suisse blew up. So did they enter into some emergency swaps at that point? And that's also what's getting dealt with. So we have 5-year swaps getting dealt with. We have maybe 2-year Credit Suisse bags getting dealt with right now. That definitely dug us down a little deeper than I was expecting. So, I did not see that happening. So, all right, I lose a little bit of, I told you, right, and I committed to that, right? I put my money where my mouth is when I think something's going to happen. I did. I started to rebuild. I got a little aggressive rebuilding my, my GME position there. Started to get bullish. Entered into short puts and whatnot. So, not an optimal entry. Kind of legging that one more down. So I eat that for being, for getting a little blindsided, I guess, by that dimension of that. But by and large, what I think is the case is, and what I think this data is saying is like, okay, yeah, we got this kind of curveball thrown in here with respect to whatever's going on with swaps or these old bags, but it does look like we are going to get this upward leg here. So certainly going to be looking to take the best advantage of current valuations of the stock that we're seeing right now, and in light of what we think this is going to mean over the next couple of weeks. Very interesting. Obviously, trade responsibly. Anything that I say is not trade advice. Don't base what you're doing off of me talking about what I think is going to happen in the stock. But all that being said, very excited for what we have to expect here over the next couple of weeks. Going to be a fun second half of October. I think the November OPEX period going to be very interesting. Very much looking forward to the institutional filing deadline, November 15th. That's going to be really cool. I think that week leading up to that is going to be probably pretty cool. Getting to go through those those forms will be very cool. And then we've got Q3 earnings just around the corner a couple weeks after that. So very, very exciting end of the year here. It's coming up. So thank you very much, as always, for watching and listening. Hope you guys found this helpful. let me know questions, likes, comments, whatever down in the comments. Always appreciate it. Always love talking to you guys. Always love hearing from you guys. Thank you very much as always. And yeah, we'll see you tomorrow. Take care, everybody.